1919, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, perhaps four of the most famous people on Earth, formed their own studio, United Artists. Hollywood had seen nothing like it before, a movie company to be run by the talent. For the next 60 years, United Artists made such classics as Some Like It Hot, Midnight Cowboy, Last Tango in Paris, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Annie Hall, Rocky, Raging Bull, and all of the James Bond pictures. But in the winter of 1979, two young executives, desperate for a picture that would propel them to the Academy Awards, decided to make a film that destroyed the company.
The American film industry is still trying to cope with a major news story out of Hollywood this week. A $40 million film by an Oscar-winning director may be the biggest bomb in Hollywood history.
One of the most ambitious, most expensive, longest Hollywood movies in many years has been yanked by United Artists.
He wanted to make the great American movie, but he's come up with dust.
Opening very strong on Saturday with $18.5 million.
Over the top spot of the weekend box office, the new film took in $26.6
million over the weekend, bringing its two-week total to almost $80 million.
Today, the shelf life of most Hollywood movies is one weekend, sometimes even less. Years of work and a small fortune of investment all come down to this. Is some teenage kid going to buy a ticket to your movie on opening weekend?
The nature of the film business is that success is a rarity. Failure is the norm. And if you want to be in the movie business, you have to be able to overcome the occasional flop.
The occasional flop. That moment when the calculus of success fails is every filmmaker's worst nightmare. But even the most spectacular flops seem like small ripples, news for a week or two, and then they quickly fade. But 25 years ago, there was one flop, one failure so spectacular that the tidal wave of change it wrought is still being felt today.
The lore of Heaven's Gate? The lore of Heaven's Gate is don't make a movie like that, because it'll finish you off. The lore of Heaven's Gate is disaster.
Failure, the ship going down, Titanic, never let a director have his way.
Betrayal. There's so many things come to my mind with Heaven's Gate. You know, Iraq even comes to mind. It's, I think Heaven's Gate was used by powers that be to stop a way of filmmaking where the author was the director and was in control of the money.
I love the movie. I really love the movie. I can watch that movie and I can't really see any fault in the movie.
The making of Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's grand epic of the American West, is the story of ego run rampant, of epic mismanagement, of staggering extravagance. But it is also the story of one man's pursuit of perfection and the creation of what many consider to be an extraordinary film. For 25 years, the sins of Heaven's Gate have obscured its virtues. It's thought of only as the biggest flop in Hollywood history. The truth, however, is at once more spectacular and more tragic. As the 1970s drew to a close, Francis Ford Coppola was finishing Apocalypse Now. Woody Allen was shooting Manhattan, and Martin Scorsese was in pre-production on Raging Bull. All three films, each a masterpiece, were being made for a single studio, United Artists.
United Artists was a special studio because They trusted filmmakers. They didn't sit and watch dailies. We didn't sit and look over their shoulder. It was a sense of mutual respect between the artists involved and the studio. And if we went with the picture and said, okay, you've got a picture now, go for it, that was it. They went off and they made the movie.
UA had long been thought of as the premier studio in town. But in 1978, after an astonishing run, it suddenly found itself a laughingstock. Arthur Krim and Bob Benjamin, the executives who had built UA's reputation as a filmmaker's studio, found themselves in a very public and very bitter fight with UA's parent company, Transamerica. Embittered by what they saw as threats to UA's autonomy, they quit to form their own studio, Orion, taking with them their most trusted executives.
UA at that time was in shambles because a man named Arthur Krim and all of his top executives had left in a dispute with the chairman of Transamerica. And Transamerica found itself owning a company, some middle-level executives, a great tradition, and a lot of ill will in Hollywood.
There was a feeling that we had these gigantic shoes to fill, and the only way that we could fill them and create reputations for ourselves and the company was to fill them with people who were not part of the previous regime. It was wonderful to have the Woody pictures and the James Bond pictures and the Rocky pictures, but those pictures were all inherited. We needed to make our own marks. Michael Cimino was a way of making our own mark, we believed.
Michael Cimino came in with his second film and just made this towering picture, The Deer Hunter. Very much in the way that Coppola and Bogdanovich and Scorsese and the rest had scored real big, real young, with very impressive pictures, but in a way even more so.
We saw an advance print of Deer Hunter, I don't know how many weeks before it was to be released, and we were blown away.
Stevie! Stevie, come down!
It was an overwhelming experience. We walked out of that screening room saying, we want to be making pictures with this man. This is a potentially great filmmaker, and we want to make pictures with him. So let's see what he would like to make.
What Michael Cimino wanted to make was the Johnson County War, a film about the West as it was. Not cowboys and Indians, but homesteaders fighting to lay claim to a better life. At the turn of the last century, great waves of European immigrants, Germans, Slavs, encroached on the grazing land of ranchers. In Johnson County, Wyoming, this conflict turned violent when the ranchers hired mercenaries to kill those immigrants it suspected of stealing cattle.
Shade Kovac! Kastor? Shade Kovac! Mitchels Kovac! Kastor! Kastoret! Kutogreve! Kastorer!
What distinguished Cimino's script was its claim that these murders were sanctioned by the governor of Wyoming, the U.S. Congress, and the President of the United States. Cimino told UA he thought he could make it for the cost of an average movie, $7.5 million. Over the next 2 years, that number would mushroom by 500%, all with the approval of the executives at United Artists. There would be appeals, threats, even prayers for cost-cutting, all to no avail. For Michael Cimino knew that the executives at UA were weak. That was evident from the beginning.
When we went into the picture, there were two givens. The two givens were Christopher Walken and Chris Christopherson. And we said, okay, who's going to play the girl? A list was drawn up. All of the major female stars of the moment were on that list. Everybody kept saying no. Suddenly, we heard this name, Isabelle Huppert.
When Michael said he wanted Isabelle Huppert, the question that was asked him, I'm sure by Stephen and I know by me, was, how's her English? He said, oh, speaks it like we do.
Excusez-moi. Bonjour.
I thought it made absolutely no sense to have a French actress playing the madam of a bordello in Wyoming in the 19th century. But Michael wanted this actress. We were told this was the only actress. Suddenly, Jane Fonda had said no, Diane Keaton had said no, everybody else had said, so it was going to have to be Isabelle Huppert.
Bachenfield offered Cimino a compromise. They'd fly to Paris, listen to Huppert read. If they could understand her English, fine. If not, Cimino would have to cast someone else for his female lead. He agreed to the deal.
Isabelle Huppert read for the role. I thought she was dead wrong. And we said to Michael, it's not going to work. She can't speak English that we can understand and that an audience is going to be able to understand. Yes, maybe she can work on it and so on, but the answer is no.
My phone rang a couple of days later. It was Cimino on the phone, and he said, I've been thinking about that, and it's still Isabelle Huppert. And I said, this is a problem now because this is no longer about Isabelle Huppert. This is now about your word. You and I had an arrangement which now doesn't mean anything. He said, what's your point? I said, my point is this, I'll give you 48 hours to tell me you didn't mean this phone call, or I'm going to do my level best to make sure that we never make this movie. He told me to go f*** myself and hung up.
At United Artists, the man who held ultimate authority over which films got made was Andy Albeck. Little more than a glorified accountant, Albeck was the man Transamerica had placed atop UA after Arthur Krim quit. Unlike Krim, Albeck made sense of the movie business through spreadsheets. He placed his faith in numbers. This made him the perfect studio head for Transamerica and the worst one possible for United Artists.
Andy says, so David, what is your problem with the movie? I said, my problem with the movie is I no longer know what his word means, Andy, and I don't know what the movie could cost. I don't know anything anymore because of what just happened. I said, David, what's your worst number? I said, Andy, we're waiting for a budget. It could be 11.5, but after today, I don't know. I could pick a number. 20. Oh, okay. Norbert, David says 20. What do you think? Norbert says, I can cover 20 out of foreign. And he says that Isabelle Huppert is not a problem for him. Everybody likes that in foreign. So Andy says, so David, look what we have here. Norbert says he can cover the entire worst case number you have out of foreign, and he likes Isabelle Huppert. So we don't have a problem, right? So I called Michael, and I told him that. And he was not surprised.
I'm afraid to look. Silly, isn't it?
Nah, I'll bring it out to you.
I personally believe she's wonderful in the picture. But the important factor, David is absolutely right, the important factor was the psychological power play that was being conducted there, and Michael won it.
A few months after Cimino won the power struggle to cast Isabelle Huppert, his coronation as the newest king of Hollywood was affirmed. The Deer Hunter took home 5 Academy Awards, including one for Best Director and another for Best Picture. Exactly 1 week later, Michael Cimino began filming Heaven's Gate.
I'm not used to seeing 57 takes. I'm really not. I'm not used to doing a minimum of 32 takes.
What does obsessed with detail mean? one is recreating a period, and one hopes that one doesn't make a mistake, so that someone in the audience says, aha, that didn't exist then, or and it jeopardizes, mistakes like that can jeopardize the audience's belief in the picture, and then the story is thrown in jeopardy and the whole movie is thrown into jeopardy. So if that is obsessive, then I'm guilty of that.
On April 16th, 1979, 1 week to the day after he won the Academy Award for Best Director, Michael Cimino began principal photography on Heaven's Gate. Cimino's ambition for his new film was not small. Heaven's Gate was going to be the Gone with the Wind, the Dr. Zhivago, the Lawrence of Arabia of the American West. It would be a towering achievement, the best Western ever made. For Michael Cimino believed that this was his moment, that Heaven's Gate would seal his place in cinematic history. He was half right. The scale of production on Heaven's Gate was immense. Whole towns were taken over for weeks at a time and converted into fully functioning period sets. Over 1,200 extras from Montana and Idaho, including many who had genuine Slovakian and Ukrainian accents, were hired. But it was not scale that Cimino was after. It was authenticity. He intended for his audience to genuinely be transported back to the West of the 1890s. His picture was going to be real, or as real as he could make it.
He created something that we fondly called Camp Cimino. Have you heard about this? 7 o'clock, you go and you take riding lessons. And then at 9 o'clock, you have cockfighting lessons. Then you have your Yugoslavian, your Slavic dialect lesson.
I mean, we had a bus that picked us up in the morning, and the first thing we did is we would go shooting off rounds of blanks. We had blank gun lessons. Then, after that, we went riding. We had riding lessons. And then after that, we went and had roller skating lessons.
I had to dance. I must have waltzed across Texas. By the end of the thing, I had to take dance lessons every day, waltzing lessons. And roller skating, God, I almost killed myself on that roller skating scene.
I had the period roller skates for him, strapped them on. They had instructors, and they'd skate for a couple of hours a day for maybe a week or 2 weeks until they were ready and they could do it.
It was taxing, but I think that was a good example where like everybody sort of like just gave what they could, because it just seemed exciting and wonderful looking, and it sort of, even when you were about to drop from heat exhaustion, you just would love to see how this thing is finally going to turn out.
And this is really true. They really have this kind of thing where the cowboys would just come in and scrape the cow off their boots and lash these wheels on their feet and get drunk. Can you imagine what that must have been like? God. We all learned for that. We could skate backwards. We could waltz on skates. You know, we had a great time on it.
And we did that for like at least 6 weeks before I ever shot a single thing. It was really, literally, we called it Camp Cimino.
While the size and scope of Cimino's epic was impressive, it was not extraordinary. Hundreds, if not thousands of films, from Ben-Hur to Close Encounters, had been made on such a massive scale. What separated Heaven's Gate from almost every film that came before or after it was the extreme, almost fanatic attention to detail its director paid to every single shot.
It was very unusual the way he worked. He would actually paint by selecting extras and put them into the right place in the set, like pretty much like a painter would paint them. He painted by picking up people and put them into the right place.
He would line up all the extras and go down the line, picking the right people for that particular scene. And it took time, you know, a couple of hours to select maybe 50 people. No, you don't stand there. You stand over there next to her, and you come over here.
There's an armed mob of paid men about to invade your county.
Then, once we started to shoot, you know, sometimes we would go for 3 takes, sometimes we would go for 10 takes. And many, many times you had to go for 40 takes.
Poprawiło ten rzeczy w tym kraju.
I'm not used to seeing 57 takes. I'm really not. I'm not used to doing a minimum of 32 takes.
They advance the idea that poor people have nothing to say in the affairs of this country.
He wanted it tried a bunch of different ways. It was like workshopping on film. You know, we did the happy version, we did the crying version, we did the furious version. I mean, each scene was taken to these degrees beyond which you weren't going for the ultimate take, you were going for a lot of choices.
I'm sure the reason for the multiple takes of different scenes was because of his attention to detail and his concern that he get it right, that it was going to last, that this was something for the ages.
I can honestly say we all thought we were making the next Gone with the Wind, because that's what Michael imbued in you, that you were making this wonderful, fabulous, important movie. And everybody gave their all.
We really believed in him. I mean, he was a wonderful, charismatic person. And if you were on the inside circle with Michael, there was nothing like it. You know, you just felt you were riding on air. And you could do anything.
The confidence Cimino imbued in others came not just from the force of his personality, but also the scale of his success. The Deer Hunter had been a towering achievement. It brought with it respect and newfound power. On Heaven's Gate, the producer was Cimino's longtime friend and associate, Joanne Corelli. Corelli had never produced before. She had held a lesser title on The Deer Hunter and owed her promotion to Cimino. In theory, she had final word on matters of budget, but no one at UA or on the set had any doubt that Heaven's Gate was Michael's show. He was the one in charge.
And there is no strong producer to be there and say, Michael, it's already 10 o'clock. Move on. There was nobody there to do that for him. So he was his own boss, basically. You know, Joanne Corelli was a producer, but they were friends. So, you know, she could not say much about it. She just had to let him go.
One day, we were shooting a scene with Christopherson drunk in his hotel room, and the mayor and the group of townsgentlemen come in.
I had to wake up from a sound, drunken sleep and crack this bullwhip across the camera. And I did it every time. So I knew at least it wasn't driving me crazy that I was messing up every time, as some other ones did.
I did watch Chris kind of come back out and, you know, and crack the whip again, and I noticed he hit his face. You know, if you crack a whip wrong, it'll come right across your face. He got himself once, and yeah, it's a pretty. I think he got maybe got somebody else once. I mean, it really, wow.
That's all we shot that day, was 52 takes of The Master. That was it. And it went on and on and on and on.
From somebody on the outside, it would look like it was almost too much. But it never appeared that way to me. It was like, oh, this guy really cares.
I bet Michelangelo cared. I bet Picasso cared, you know. Anybody who has believes in his artistic vision, I bet they care. I probably didn't care that much, but I was glad to be working with somebody who did.
In the coming months, there would be an avalanche of bad press about Heaven's Gate, consuming any consideration for the artistic value of Cimino's film. A picture would be painted of chaos and incompetence, but that simply was not true. On Michael Cimino's set, there was the opposite, a calm, determined, relentless pursuit of perfection. Unfortunately, that costs a lot of money. It didn't take long for Stephen Bach and David Field to realize that something was disastrously wrong with Heaven's Gate, at least from the perspective of the studio paying the bills. In fact, they knew something had to be done 1 week into production. For at the end of the first 6 days of shooting, Michael Cimino had fallen 5 days behind schedule and spent $900,000 for a minute and a half of usable film. 2 weeks in, he was 10 days behind schedule and 15 pages behind. By then, Michael Cimino had exposed 2 hours of film, less than 3 minutes of which he was willing to approve, all at a rough cost of $1 million per usable minute. The alarm bells went off at UA.
Michael always said, you always tell the studio what they want to hear, and then you just do what you're going to do.
All right, let's just take that last little bit again.
Atmosphere here on the sidewalk. You know what your instructions are. Quiet, please. Quiet, please. Ready?
Here we go. Stand by and roll, please.
Be camera mark.
And action.
Hollywood in the 1970s was infatuated with the director. For nearly a decade, it lavished its attention and money on director-driven films.
And cut. Print.
But by 1979, auteurs were no longer such a wise investment. Peter Bogdanovich had permanently damaged his career with At Long Last Love. William Friedkin had failed spectacularly when he remade the French classic Wages of Fear. Even Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg had suffered their own setbacks. New York, New York, in 1941. And then there was Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. In time, Hollywood would pass judgment on this debacle. UA should have fired Cimino. They should have shut down production. But to the executives at UA, who were not operating with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, the solution to their Cimino problem wasn't so clear.
What we wanted was a picture. We never didn't want the picture, you see. If we had been able to sit back and say, oh, who the hell cares? We don't want the picture anyway. Let's just cut it off now, settle the lawsuits, and the money that we would have spent on Heaven's Gate, we'll spend on these 10 other pictures, which are nice pictures that we can't now afford to make because we're putting all the money in Montana. It was never that. We always wanted the picture, rightly or wrongly.
The executives at United Artists had entered Heaven's Gate believing it would propel them to the Academy Awards, validate them in the wake of Arthur Krim's departure. But just weeks into production, it was alarmingly clear that more than status was at stake. Heaven's Gate was shaping up to be the longest, most expensive film in Hollywood history, the kind of picture that ends careers. UA knew they had to contain the damage, rein in Cimino. But as they started to search for answers, it was also clear they had no experience to draw on.
I had not been that close to a shooting movie in my life. This was my... I mean, well, a year before, I'd been on the third floor of 20th Century Fox as a glorified story editor for Alan Ladd Jr. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing.
None of us had been through an experience like this before. But other people in the movie business had. So we looked at what are the basic options in film history. So there was the Cleopatra option.
Cleopatra was the most notorious Hollywood debacle before Heaven's Gate. Made in 1963, its production costs became so overwhelming that 20th Century Fox was forced to shut its doors for 4 months, take everyone off payroll, and hope for the best. It was only the public's fascination with the off-screen romance of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton that saved the film and the studio from total disaster.
The Cleopatra option is let it go where it goes and pray. That was something we could not allow to happen. We could not allow Heaven's Gate to close the doors of UA and send everybody home and pray that the picture would work at the box office. So that wasn't going to work. Well, the next option that I remember we discussed was the Queen Kelly option.
Queen Kelly was a 1928 Gloria Swanson film directed by Erich von Stroheim. Von Stroheim's vision was epic, but the film's overt sexuality and von Stroheim's unbridled spending forced Joseph P. Kennedy, the film's backer and Swanson's lover, to shut down production.
That was one of our options. We just eat what we've already spent and send everybody home and forget about it. That would have been a very damaging thing for us to do. We would have been Philistines by firing this man who has just won 5 Academy Awards. So this was not a good option. But there was another one. And the other one was Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now suffered from heart attacks, suffered from typhoons. It had gone triple budget or whatever it went. And yet, a terrific, wonderful, admirable movie emerged. And we thought, if we can somehow or other pull in the reins, be persuasive, cajole, spank, whatever we have to do, somehow we're going to pull Apocalypse Now out of Heaven's Gate.
Having settled on the Apocalypse Now option, Bach and Field started to look for ways to contain costs, to streamline production in Montana. The only problem was that Heaven's Gate was not suffering from heart attacks or typhoons. No acts of God were disrupting anything. The only disaster, natural or otherwise, was the director.
They don't know Cimino. They only knew him when they look at, well, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, his first project, first film, was on schedule, on budget. Deer Hunter went over, but there were legitimate reasons. And it wins the Academy Award, and it's beautiful. But they don't know what transpired in his career prior to Thunderbolt and Lightfoot.
Take me along. If you love me, take me along. If you love me, take me along with you.
I love you, little cutie, but the office is my duty.
Michael Cimino began his directing career in advertising, working on commercials for Kodak, Pepsi, and United Airlines.
The clients of the agencies liked Cimino. His visuals were fabulous, but the amount of time it took was just astronomical because he was so meticulous and took so long. Nothing was easy with Michael.
In a world where spending 2 hours lighting a prop is not only common but celebrated, Michael Cimino excelled. But making minute movies for Madison Avenue couldn't fulfill his ambitions. Cimino needed to paint on a much larger canvas. In the early 70s, Cimino left New York for Hollywood, where he quickly co-wrote 2 movies, Silent Running and the Clint Eastwood vehicle, Magnum Force. Both were solid hits, and on his 3rd film, Cimino got his first chance to direct.
Have a cigar.
Where the hell did these come from?
I've been saving them for a celebration.
Clint gave him a big break to direct this film. And Clint is a as an actor and as a producer, doesn't like to do a lot of takes. You know, he'll do maybe 3, and I would always go to Mike, I remember, and say, can I do one more? I think I got an idea. And he said, well, I'll have to ask Clint, you know. Clint would always say, give the kid a shot.
I don't think of us as criminals, you know? I feel we accomplished something, a good job.
Clint was the only guy that ever said no.
You all right, kid? You don't look too well.
Michael said, okay, let's go for another take. It was take 4. Clint would say, no, we got enough. We got it. And we move on. And that's the way it went. And if he took too long in getting it ready, he said, looks good, let's go.
For a month, United Artists sat in Los Angeles searching for ways to speed up production on Heaven's Gate. But it amounted to little more than wringing their hands. Michael Cimino, with Joanne Corelli as his producer, continued to fall behind schedule 1 day for each day shot. UA quickly calculated the cost to complete if Cimino was left unchecked. Their numbers were shocking. At Cimino's current pace, Heaven's Gate would finish principal photography 200 days late on a picture that was only supposed to take 69 days to film. Then there was the matter of cost, including post-production, prints, advertising, and interest. UA calculated that Heaven's Gate, whose approved budget had been $12.5 million, would cost the studio $50 million, making it the most expensive motion picture ever. Bachenfield flew to Montana to confront their director.
Michael always said, you always tell the studio what they want to hear, and then you just do what you're going to do. And Michael gave us very specific scenes that we were to show them, nice, long vistas, you know. I mean, if you look at any individual scene in a long shot, it's amazing. I mean, the detail that went into everything, and it's all there on film.
The footage was ravishing. There was nothing that anybody on earth could say to criticize the footage. So we knew that it wasn't a case of a production that was falling apart. We never thought that it was a case of Michael was sitting in his trailer eating chocolates and watching television when he should have been out on the set. That was never the issue. The issue was we didn't agree that you could take this much time to achieve perfection. And if you continue to take this much time to achieve perfection, you're going to break our bank, and there's not going to be any company to release the picture.
The folly of letting Cimino mind his own store became increasingly clear to UA. What they needed was someone in Montana to look after their interests, to voice their concerns. And so, in a break with UA tradition, Derek Kavanaugh, a mid-level executive with extensive production experience, was installed on the Heaven's Gate set. UA took pains to tell Cimino that this was not a hostile move. Kavanaugh was simply there to help Joanne Corelli speed up production and keep down costs. But Michael Cimino saw it differently.
I was the enemy, yes, I was the representative of those people on the other side of the fence, whom Michael should have considered to be supportive and not in any way an opponent.
That night, Michael Cimino dictated a memo. He addressed it to David Field, but also posted it for all to see. It read, Derek Kavanaugh is not to come to the location site. He is not to enter the editing room. He is not to speak to me at all. It was time for option 4, fire the director.
We then realized we were truly in trouble, because then you're saying, Michelangelo, put down your paintbrush. And he's saying, make me.
Yes, I am insistent on certain things, on certain locations, on ways of doing things, all in the interest of trying to do it in the best possible way. And in that respect, every movie director is a dictator. Every movie director is a bit of a tyrant. It goes with the job.
Well, you know, it's unfair to judge artists at work. But I certainly thought maybe in those days that everything could have been going a little bit faster and still get the same result. But, you know, you cannot criticize somebody who wants to do the best film in his life and wants to make it right.
Vilmos told me at one point, I think Michael has fallen in love with this film. And if there was any excess, it might have been that.
There was one day, it was early morning, and we had started work at 4 in the morning with a dawn shot. And we shot in the morning, and the sun was there. And then the clouds came in, and we lost the light total. It was totally overcast. And Michael, we waited. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and we sat, and we sat, and we sat.
Noon went by, and we didn't stop for lunch. And so went 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock.
Michael was waiting for this weather to clear, and it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we hadn't had lunch yet. So all the crew guys, everybody's on meal penalty, and it kept adding up and adding up and adding up. It was amazing.
Then finally, second AD took the courage and walked up and said, Michael, what about lunch? And then Michael Cimino, you know, just like he was in a daze of creating, you know, he said, lunch? This is bigger than lunch. Heaven's Gate was bigger than lunch.
Most directors are there to put their ideas onto film. They're not interested in how much does this cost or, you know, what we know. You have to break now for lunch. Why? I don't have to break now for lunch. I can see the sun coming over the hill. You know, there's that beautiful cloud. That will be there for all eternity if I get it on film. Nobody cares about the lunch hour 20 years from now, but they'll be able to see that visual that I've created forever. And that's what it's about. Yes, you're paying the bills, but Michael wasn't paying the bills.
We did believe that he had decided, I don't care what it costs, I don't care what happens to UA or at UA, I'm making my movie, and it's going to be the greatest movie I know how to make. And once we decided that was it, we then realized we were truly in trouble. Because then you're saying, Michelangelo, put down your paintbrush. And he's saying, make me.
By mid-July 1979, Michael Cimino had burned through hundreds of thousands of feet of film and was almost 200% over his original budget estimate. The futility of trying to push, cajole, or beg Cimino into moving faster was now obvious, even to the most inexperienced UA executive. More drastic options were in order.
I said to him, I know what you think of me and how ill-equipped and diminished I am as an executive, so how about this? You have told me about how wonderful Barry Spikings is in EMI and how good they were on Deer Hunter. How about if Andy Obeck and Transamerica let me? I'm going to call Barry Spikings and I'm going to offer him half this movie for whatever it costs to complete. And, if Andy lets me do it, domestic distribution, so that when you get all the awards for this movie, you don't have to see any of us. You can stand back up there with him, your pal. What do you say? If he says yes, I'm out. You shoot the damn thing however you and he decide. If he says no, you shut the f*** up and finish this movie the way I just told you. If Spikings came, saw footage, saw the books, didn't want it.
And then the question was, fire him. Bring in somebody else to finish this movie in which we have by this time spent $15 or $20 million and don't have a movie to show for it.
How? There was nothing without Michael. Michael wrote it. He conceived the whole project. Every single minutiae on that film was Michael. Everybody would have walked, I'm sure. I mean, there'd have been a laughing stock. I mean, they were ultimately anyway, but they had a chance this way. There was no chance the other way.
Having exhausted all other options, UA finally decided it had no choice but to fire Cimino's producer and take over the day-to-day operations on Heaven's Gate.
We said Joanne is no longer producing the picture. United Artists is now producing the picture, and you, Michael Cimino, are our employee. And as our employee, we can tell you, these are the rules. You violate those rules, and you are in breach of contract. And when you are in breach of contract, you lose all of the things that you want. The most important issue was, if you violate enough of these provisions of the contract, now that you are an employee of United Artists, not a partner, but an employee, you will lose Final Cut. And this was the issue that was paramount beyond any other issue for Michael.
It had taken nearly 3 months and $18 million before UA canceled the blank check they had given Cimino. In its place, the studio imposed a new production schedule and told Cimino that they would not spend 1 penny more than $25 million. Cimino protested, but it didn't matter. He had no choice but to live within UA's constraints. If he didn't, he'd lose the power to make his film, lose Final Cut. And so, he sped up. By late August, Cimino was actually 2 days ahead of UA's new schedule and on target to meet the revised budget. But it was too late. The real damage of Cimino's obsessions had already been done. Les Capet was a freelance writer living in Montana. Early in production, he had requested access to the Heaven's Gate set. He was told that Heaven's Gate was closed, that Michael Cimino was not allowing any press. Rebuffed as a journalist, Capet applied for a job as an extra and worked on the movie for 2 months. He got $30 a day for his troubles and his story. Capet's article, which first appeared in the Los Angeles Times, painted a picture of excess and incompetence. Extras were fainting, horses were hurt, and there were all those takes of the same scene over and over again. Heaven's Gate, as Capet told it, was a farce, not a masterpiece. The press loved it. The story, or some version of it, ran in almost every media outlet in the country, and many outside it. Everyone seemed downright gleeful at the prospect of this Oscar-winning director failing spectacularly.
It created an environment where people were waiting for not a masterpiece, something else. And that just kept rolling and feeding on itself.
Here we go. Stand by and roll, please.
Bad press, an angry studio, all of it might have cowed a less confident director. But for Michael Cimino, none of it registered. He just kept working, undeterred, at the same crushing pace.
Action!
In late August, 60 days after production was supposed to be finished, filming began on the climactic battle sequence. Cimino supposedly was now bound to UA's new schedule and budget. Still, he shot what and where he wanted, even if that meant traveling 3 hours each way to the only set he would approve.
Was that what it was? 3 hours each way? Oh, God, I can't remember. I blocked it out, but that was tough. Yeah.
You get up at 3:30 in the morning with a pillow, and you'd go and get in these vans, and you knew how to be there really quick so that you were one of the first ones in and would get the optimum spot to be in.
Everybody had their spot in the van, and everybody would show up in the hotel lobby with pillows and blankets, and you'd get in the van, and everybody would go to sleep for 2 hours.
And most of it was dirt roads. So it was like bam, 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 bam for hours.
It was a real force march. The lunches were, I didn't even eat. I would go straight in there and go to sleep in that little honey wagon there and sweat like a trooper, and go back to work.
I don't know how long we shot those battle scenes, but it was frightening, some of those things. Each time, I would just pray to God, I wasn't going to get hurt or anybody else was going to get hurt, and we would just go, yeah, charge, and just full blast. I mean, it was exhilarating, but even in a real battle, you don't, go recock and keep doing it over and over.
You'd race madly around in this circle at a dead gallop as fast as you can, and firing and firing and firing. And we would do that for 3 minutes, 4 minutes. So you've got all this noise and chaos, they're firing back. You have wagons in the mix, dust so thick you can hardly see.
The extras especially, I think, were quite scared, because there are these 130-year-old, buckboards, whether they were real or replicas, careening around. And, it's not like driving a Hummer. It's scary. There were times when there was coming down, I suppose, from Michael through the ADs of like, we're going again, faster, louder, bigger, more.
On September 29, 1979, filming finished on the battle sequence. 3 days later, principal photography on Heaven's Gate ended. Michael Cimino had shot a record 1.5 million feet of film, 225 hours of footage, and spent in excess of 100% over his approved budget. But at least everyone thought the worst was finally over. They had no idea.
I told Michael, I said, man, this thing better be good, because if it isn't, they're going to kill you.
It's hard to shock Hollywood. Drugs, sex, even embezzlement are all excused as just another part of the business. It takes a lot in this town to ruin a career. But there is one sin for which Hollywood has always been unforgiving: failure.
I went to this party, it was given by Michael Douglas, and there were a lot of people, a lot of directors there and producers, and most of these people were the more of the arty bend, which was UA's type of. They would do films that UA would finance, and they weren't getting their films green-lighted. And they were told because of all the money was going to Michael, and they were furious. And I went back and I said, and I told Michael, I said, man, this thing better be good, because if it isn't, they're gonna kill you.
Michael Cimino returned to Hollywood 6 months after The Deer Hunter had swept the Oscars, confident that he had shot another masterpiece. United Artists also remained committed to Cimino and his vision. Despite the turmoil of production, they still believed in Heaven's Gate. All that remained was to edit down the mountain of footage Michael Cimino had shot.
When we got back, we had, it's quite funny actually, we had bars put up on the cutting room windows. And then we had all the locks changed so that nobody could come in. He said, we're not showing it to them, I'm not showing it to them until I'm ready. He wasn't afraid of anybody, and I mean, sometimes we'd be there and a call would come in from somebody and he would, he'd get on the phone and he'd scream and yell and swear at them and tell them this and that and the other, and, they weren't going to mess with him, and he'd slam down the phone, and then he'd just turn to me and he'd smile, and we'd just keep going.
For month after month, Michael Cimino and UA had locked horns. They had fought over casting, schedule, budget. That there was now tension during editing surprised no one. Nevertheless, it took its toll. After nearly a year of production on Heaven's Gate, David Field resigned from United Artists. He gave no official reason for his departure, other than to say it was for personal reasons.
I have one regret in my life, in my working life, and that's that I left United Artists. I don't know what would have happened had I stayed. Maybe nothing would have changed. But I fault myself for walking away in the middle of that.
With David Field gone, Stephen Bach was left as the sole executive in charge of production at UA. One of his first tasks was to oversee the shooting of even more film on Heaven's Gate. By completing principal photography according to UA's imposed schedule and budget, Michael Cimino had won the right to shoot the movie's prologue, Graduation Day at Harvard, 20 years before the main action of the film. Shot in Oxford, England, after Harvard refused permission, the prologue was as complicated and ambitious as anything shot in Montana. The only difference was that UA severely limited the time and money they gave Cimino.
At the end of every day's shooting, a phone call went out from Oxford to tell me that the day's shooting had been completed on budget and on schedule. And Michael had been told, if I get a call that says we shot 5 minutes longer than we said we would, and we spent $500 more than we said we would, I will pull the plug and there will be no prologue, there will be no epilogue. And Michael believed it. A little late in the game.
Michael Cimino had entered the editing room with over 1 million feet of film, some 220 hours of footage. From that, he was contractually obligated to deliver a final cut no longer than 3 hours in length. Editing this amount of film under normal circumstances would have been a Herculean task, but UA made it nearly impossible by demanding that Cimino make their Christmas release.
Well, Christmas because of the Oscars. Always the Oscars, that's the big drive with any film of any importance. You want to make that December release. And we worked, there weren't enough hours. We never stopped. There were days where we would go 3 days without sleeping. And so when you get to that point, you don't really know what you're doing anyway, because you're just so tired.
In late June, after 8 months of editing, Michael Cimino announced that he was ready to show the executives at United Artists Heaven's Gate.
We got to the screening room and we saw Michael, spoke with Michael. I thought Michael looked exhausted, truly depleted. I remember asking, how close are we to a final cut? And he said, it's a little long. I can lose maybe 15 minutes. And we sat down and we watched the movie. And the movie that we saw was 5 hours and 25 minutes long. The battle sequence alone was as long as most feature motion pictures. I was angry. The company had been put through turmoil. Other projects had gotten canceled or never made. Relationships within the company were deeply strained, some of them irreparably. The company was exposed in the industry at large in a way that few companies have been. And the internal hope that had kept us all going for those 2 or 3 years of this process now, which was that it was going to be a masterpiece and that would justify everything that we had gone through, was suddenly gone.
Michael Cimino re-entered his editing room to begin another round of 18-hour days. Access to him became impossible. By mid-October, he had brought his epic down to just over 3.5 hours. Amazingly, no one at UA, not Stephen Bach, not Andy Olbeck, no one saw the final version of Heaven's Gate before its release. Insisting on doing so was useless anyway. no changes could be made without endangering the New York premiere. Michael Cimino had gotten final cut.
I can remember going to the first screening, the premiere in New York, and we were all very excited, and Mike was quite anxious because I don't know if he even saw the film before it was shown. I mean, it was wet right out of the soup. He had just put it together, and you just barely made the deadline to get it all together. And the movie comes on.
Good morning, Mr. Abrams.
Morning, George. Miss Eggleston.
I remember my first impression of seeing it was, this kind of the splendor of it was wonderful, but the rhythm of it was so unusual and so kind of slow and not what you expected to see that the audience certainly was frustrated. Then you heard that terrible applause at the end. It was just, it was terrible. And then hearing the next day we got up, and on the way to the airport, we were going up to Toronto for the next show, and picking up that review on the way to the airport and reading it.
The next day's papers sealed the fate of Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino, Stephen Bach, and Andy Olbeck. Vincent Canby in the New York Times wrote with abandon and malice. Heaven's Gate fails so completely, he began. You might suspect Mr. Cimino sold his soul to the devil to obtain the success of The Deer Hunter, and the devil has come round to collect. Watching the film is like a forced 4-hour walking tour of one's own living room. Heaven's Gate is an unqualified disaster.
Well, I read Vincent Canby's. I don't read reviews. That's the first thing. I read Vincent Canby's because it actually had the line in it, like being given a 4-hour tour of your own living room, and I just wanted to see how bad can a review be, and it was really scathing, angry review. I mean, basically, everything that people hated about the direction of film was piled onto Michael.
I think the critics were reviewing the production history. They were rewriting their reviews for The Deer Hunter, which they thought they had overpraised. They were getting back at what they perceived as a hostile treatment from the director. I think they were slapping United Artists for having allowed this to happen. But I never felt that there was a real serious attempt to see what is this picture trying to do, and does it succeed on its own terms? It didn't succeed on the terms they wanted to lay on the picture. And that was what they were writing about, was their terms for the picture, not the picture's terms.
On November 24th, 1980, after a one-week run in New York, United Artists and Michael Cimino took out a full-page ad in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. It read, Dear Andy, so much energy, time, and money have gone into the making of Heaven's Gate that I am asking you to withdraw the film from distribution, to allow me to present to the public a film finished with the same care and thoughtfulness with which we began it. It was signed, Sincerely, Michael Cimino.
Even bad movies have at least something good you can say about them, and this one had nothing.
The American film industry is still trying to cope with a major news story out of Hollywood this week. A $40 million film by an Oscar-winning director may be the biggest bomb in Hollywood history. Get the story now.
Writer-director Michael Cimino, who spent 2 years and $36 million on Heaven's Gate.
For 2 years, Michael Cimino had worked ceaselessly, risked everything, put his whole self into Heaven's Gate, only to have the critics eviscerate it.
the more you saw that there was nothing on that screen there at all, nothing at all. I mean, not even a good performance. You couldn't even single out one great performance. You know, usually every movie has one great scene. Even bad movies have at least something good you can say about them, and this one had nothing.
It was, it was like, how can they not like our child? I mean, that's how you feel. It's very personal. And you don't want to believe that you have an ugly baby. Nobody does. Every baby's beautiful. And, don't they see the qualities and don't they understand? You just think they're ignorant.
Michael was blown out of the water. I always felt like it was like you had a beloved child, of yours murdered, and then the murder blamed on you. And it was unjust.
Heaven's Gate had been pulled by United Artists at Cimino's request after only a one-week run in New York. UA had hoped to give the film a second life, but it was a decision that quickly backfired. Heaven's Gate was transformed from a simple flop into a full-blown media event.
The notion of industry stories and business stories seeping into the national media had already begun in a certain way, and this was something that really kind of burst the floodgates.
Expensive movies ever made, and in its
Heaven's
original
Gate
version
has been yanked by United Artists.
Panned so bad that it was immediately withdrawn so that large parts could be cut out.
Tell us United Artists knew Heaven's Gate was in big trouble 6 months ago.
Somebody ought to have said stop to this film, but no one did.
It was a disaster. It was a disaster creatively because people misunderstood and thought that we, United Artists, had forced Michael to do the withdrawal and the cutting, which wasn't true at all. It was totally Michael's idea as far as I've ever heard.
I don't care where the idea came from. It was a horrible idea to pull the film. Because it was an admission that everybody thought Canby was right.
Michael always did what Michael wanted to do, and now he wanted to make it shorter. Because he wanted the film to see the light of day, and he wanted people to like the film. He wanted it to be seen. So he was then determined that he was going to try and bring it down and make it more presentable. Although he may not personally agree with that, he was going to do his best to try and make it more presentable.
Michael Cimino had barely re-entered the editing room when the bloodbath started. The first body to fall was Andy Olbeck's. We had a bad year, he told friends privately. When you have a bad year, you fire the boss. In Olbeck's place, Transamerica installed Norbert Auerbach, the UA executive who had guaranteed David Field's worst-case number 2 years earlier. In late April 1981, 5 months after its disastrous first screening, a radically recut version of Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate opened in Los Angeles.
Okay, Michael Cimino. Mr. Cimino is here.
And as Michael makes his way...
Cimino has worked literally day and night re-editing Heaven's Gate. It now runs 2.5 hours. That's an hour and 10 minutes shorter than it was, thanks to some 300 changes. Ballpark figure, $35 million the first time around. I did a little arithmetic. 100 American families making $25,000 a year each. Money for a single movie.
I think that one has to understand what the motives were. Is it obscene to spend $30 or $40 million on a blatantly commercial effort whose sole purpose is to make more money? Is that obscene?
The nature of Gene Shalit's questions, to ask how many starving orphans could have been fed forever, what is it? That doesn't have anything to do with the picture as a picture. And it was the perceived enormity of waste and arrogance with money that people were focusing on.
There was, however, one dissenting rave. Kevin Thomas, the LA Times film critic, wrote, "Heaven's Gate is an experience that leaves you feeling you have witnessed a true screen epic." He called the acting splendid and noted the level of craftsmanship could scarcely be higher. It is time, he concluded, to sit back and enjoy all that Michael Cimino has wrought. Thomas later noted, "I don't think in 20 years of movie reviewing I've ever been so totally alone."
Vincent Canby of the New York Times has seen the new, shorter version, and he wrote that the movie looks like a fat man who's been on a crash diet. Thinner, but not appreciably different.
Worst movie I ever saw. Really, terrible movie.
Gorgeous music, gorgeous photography, but it's a real fanny twitcher.
I think it still needs some pruning, frankly.
It was a little long, it was a little boring, and I don't think it was the story people wanted to hear.
The press's obsessions, starting with Les Gapet and bleeding into Vincent Canby, overwhelmed whatever virtues Cimino's film had. Heaven's Gate cost United Artists $44 million to make and release. In the end, its total gross was $1.3 million. It was time to dump the next body overboard.
I knew that I was going to be fired. It was in the air. There was just no way that I was going to survive. Who else are they going to fire to make a point? They were going to make a corporate point that something disastrous has happened and we have lanced the boil by firing Stephen Bach.
A few days after Stephen Bach was fired, Transamerica announced that it was selling United Artists to MGM. It was tired of having its corporate image tied to a failing studio, tired of the movie business. The studio that Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith had started 60 years earlier was gone. Hollywood gasped. The unthinkable had happened. A single film had sunk a studio, or so it seemed. Michael Cimino and Norbert Auerbach were at the Cannes Film Festival when the headlines broke. Auerbach, shocked by the news, took the occasion to blame Heaven's Gate for all that was wrong in Hollywood.
I didn't realize the extent of it, really, until Cannes. When I looked at the newspaper and a thing that was written by Auerbach, who was the president of UA, who said that unless control of the money was taken away from the creative people, that the industry was headed for disaster. And we ran into each other in the hallway on the way to this press thing on where we're all going to be sitting on a stage, and he and his lawyer were there. And I said, who are you going to give it to? The uncreative people? And so the uncreative people won. And that's what happened to the business.
You could argue almost that post-Michael Cimino, the time of the director was over. He single-handedly, whether fairly or unfairly, was the signpost that said, from now on, we're not going to let directors have that kind of power anymore. Because we don't want our studio maybe to go next, or we don't want anybody to do that to us.
Heaven's Gate was received warmly, even enthusiastically, by the critics in Europe, where today it is recognized as an accomplished work of art. But in America, a cloud still hangs over Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. It is known as the biggest flop ever, the film that bankrupted a studio. The truth is, Transamerica was a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. It wrote off the entire loss of Heaven's Gate, $44 million, 2 days after its New York premiere. Its stock fell 0.5 point, which it fully recovered the next day. In the 25 years since Heaven's Gate, much has changed. Box office totals are now tracked by every media outlet in the country, and films are judged a success or failure in a single weekend. The business of Hollywood has overwhelmed everything else, and it's hard to see how the movies are better off for it. And what of Heaven's Gate? For most, it's just a cautionary tale, an interesting footnote. But for others, Heaven's Gate is a beautiful, ambitious film just waiting to be rediscovered.
I would respond to Heaven's Gate the same way Jack Kennedy responded to the Bay of Pigs. I take full responsibility, and all other questions are answered by the film itself. I think if you're a boxer and you step into the ring, you can't complain about getting hit.
I think about Heaven's Gate all the time because I live in the horror house set from Heaven's Gate in Montana. That's my home there. When we were finished shooting that set, the owners of the land were going to burn it down. Michael said, "Anybody want this set?" And I shot my hand up, numbered the logs, and moved it a couple of 100 miles south, and that's where it stands today.